The road stretched out before me like a serpent, endless and winding, bathed in the dull glow of my headlights. It was well past midnight, and exhaustion clung to my bones. My fingers gripped the wheel tightly as I fought to keep my eyes open. The rhythmic hum of tyres against the asphalt threatened to lull me into a trance. I spotted a dingy, run-down diner just off the highway, its neon sign flickering weakly, casting an eerie red glow across the cracked and empty parking lot. The sign sputtered on and off, each flicker bathing the diner in a sickly crimson hue that felt more like a warning than an invitation. I should have kept driving, but my stomach gnawed at me, and my head throbbed with fatigue. Against my better judgment, I pulled into the lot, the gravel crunching beneath the tyres. The diner's windows were fogged over with grime, and the flickering neon bathed everything in a hellish glow. I hesitated for a moment, my instincts screaming to turn back. Something about the place felt wrong, but the ache in my stomach urged me forward. I pushed open the door, and the faint jingle of a bell overhead greeted me, though it felt more like the toll of a funeral chime. The inside was even worse than the outside, a dusty relic frozen in time, the kind of place that hadn't seen new customers in years. Booths lined the walls, their vinyl seats cracked and peeling. A sticky layer of grease coated every surface, and the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and something sour I couldn't quite place. There was only one other person inside, a hunched figure seated at the counter, his back to me. He wore a ragged coat, dark and tattered, and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured most of his face. His posture was unnervingly still, as though he had been sitting there for centuries. The waitress, a gaunt, hollow-eyed woman who looked like she hadn't slept in weeks, shuffled over to me with a menu that had seen better days. She didn't even look at me, her eyes fixed on the floor as she handed it to me with trembling hands. Her name tag read Martha, though the letters were faded and nearly illegible. I slid into the nearest booth, my back to the man at the counter, but I could feel his presence, a heavy, oppressive force that seemed to weigh down the entire diner. The waitress lingered, her gaze darting nervously between me and the figure. "Coffee and pie," I muttered, trying to shake the unease that was gnawing at my insides. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, like I was breathing in the fumes of something long dead. Martha disappeared into the kitchen, leaving me alone with the man. I couldn't stop myself from glancing over my shoulder. He hadn't moved, hadn't so much as twitched. He just sat there, hunched over the counter, staring into the depths of a chipped ceramic mug. My coffee and pie arrived, but I couldn't touch them. My appetite had evaporated, replaced by a growing sense of dread. I leaned forward, my voice barely a whisper. "What's up with him?" The waitress flinched as if I had struck her. Her face drained of colour, and her eyes widened with fear. She cast a nervous glance at the man before leaning in close. Her voice trembled. "He's been here since last night. Hasn't said a word, hasn't touched his drink. I called the cops, but..." Her voice trailed off as she looked around, her eyes glassy. "They never came." A cold knot formed in my gut. "Since last night?" She nodded, her fingers gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles were white. "You shouldn't talk to him. People who do don't stay, they don't leave." The way she said it, her voice low and broken, sent a chill up my spine. My eyes flickered back to the man. His stillness was unnatural, like a wax figure, perfectly posed, frozen in time. I tried to shake it off, chalking it up to exhaustion and nerves. I focused on my coffee, but I could feel him, watching, waiting. Finally, curiosity got the better of me. My pulse quickened, and my hands felt clammy as I stood up and approached the man at the counter. Each step felt heavy, like I was wading through thick mud. I reached out, hesitating for a moment before gently tapping his shoulder. His coat was cold to the touch, far colder than it should have been, as if it had been sitting in a freezer for hours. The waitress screamed, a high-pitched, animalistic sound that pierced the air. "No! Don't!" but it was too late. The moment my fingers brushed the fabric, the air changed. The lights flickered, then dimmed until only the weak glow of the neon sign outside lit the room. The hum of electricity vanished, replaced by an eerie, all-consuming silence. No distant cars, no buzzing lights, just nothing. I looked around in a panic. The waitress was gone, her station behind the counter empty, as if she had never been there at all. My pulse raced, the terror blooming in my chest. And then the man moved. Slowly, impossibly slowly, his head turned toward me. The brim of his hat lifted just enough for me to see beneath it. My heart seized in my chest. There was no face, no eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a black, endless void. A pit of nothingness that seemed to suck the light from the room. My legs buckled and I stumbled back, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body refused to listen. The man, or the thing that wore his shape, rose to its feet. It towered over me, the void where its face should have been seeming to grow, to expand, swallowing everything in its path. My skin crawled as it rasped. "I never leave." The words echoed in the empty diner, reverberating inside my skull like nails being hammered into my brain. Its hand, cold, skeletal, and impossibly strong, shot out, grasping my wrist. The touch burned like ice, and I screamed as the flesh on my arm began to peel away, flaking off like old paint, revealing raw, red muscle beneath. My legs finally found their strength, and I tore myself free, stumbling backward, but it followed. The lights flickered violently now, casting jagged shadows as the walls seemed to close in around me. I ran for the door, but the ground beneath me felt unstable, like I was running across quicksand. I looked down in horror to see the floor writhing, pulsing with dark, tendril-like veins that wrapped around my ankles, pulling me back toward the figure. I fell hard, my face slamming into the linoleum floor. Blood filled my mouth as I felt my teeth crack against the surface. I struggled to get up, but the veins held me tight, dragging me closer to the thing that should not exist. It bent down, its face, or lack thereof, mere inches from mine. I could feel the void pulling at my very soul, like it was sucking the life out of me, piece by piece. I screamed as its icy fingers dug into my chest, ripping flesh and bone aside like paper. My vision blurred, the edges of my world darkening as it reached for my heart. And then, darkness. I woke up in my car, drenched in sweat, parked on the side of the highway as if I had never left. But my arm, my wrist still bore the burn of its touch, raw and oozing. And in the distance, flickering faintly against the horizon, was the red glow of that cursed neon sign. It's still out there, waiting.
Late-night diners had always been a haven for me. There was something comforting about the solitude, the way the low hum of a jukebox played forgotten songs, the occasional clatter of dishes echoing from the kitchen. It was a place where time seemed to slow down and I could enjoy the peace. But that night, everything changed. I found myself in a part of town I didn't recognize, a maze of narrow streets and dim streetlights. That's when I saw it, the diner. It looked ancient, forgotten, the kind of place that hadn't seen a renovation in decades. The neon sign flickered weakly, casting a sickly green glow on the empty parking lot. Open 24 hours, it read, though no cars were in sight. Hunger gnawed at me, and despite the eerie vibe, I decided to go inside. The bell above the door let out a jarring clang as I entered. The interior was cold, unnaturally cold, and the staleness in the air made my stomach churn. The diner was nearly empty, save for one other customer, a woman sitting alone in a booth at the far corner. Her long jet-black hair cascaded over her shoulders, shielding her face. She sat unnaturally still, hands clasped in front of her, as if waiting for something or someone. I couldn't see her face, but the rigidity of her posture sent a chill down my spine. I slid into a booth a few seats away and grabbed the sticky, laminated menu. My eyes scanned the list, but my focus kept drifting toward her. She hadn't moved since I came in, not a twitch, not even a shift of weight. Something was off about her, about the entire place. The waitress shuffled over, a frail older woman with deep lines etched into her face. Her smile was stiff, forced, like it had been glued on. As she stood next to my booth, her eyes briefly flicked to the woman in the corner, and I swore I saw a flash of fear in them. "What'll you have?" Her voice was flat, void of any warmth. I glanced at the woman again, unable to resist. "Who's she?" I nodded toward the corner booth. The waitress stiffened, her eyes widening ever so slightly. Her gaze darted around the room before she leaned in closer to me, her voice dropping to a strained whisper. "Don't worry about her. Keep your head down, eat and leave." I blinked, startled by her intensity. "What do you mean? Is she okay?" The waitress's hand trembled as she placed the notepad down on the table. "You shouldn't have come here," she murmured, her eyes now glued to the floor. She turned quickly and disappeared into the kitchen, leaving me with nothing but the oppressive silence of the diner. I shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the woman once more. She still hadn't moved. Her back was so straight it was unnerving, as if she'd been carved from stone. Every fiber of my being told me to leave, to get up and walk out, but something about her. I was drawn to her. It was like a black hole, pulling me in, compelling me to stay. My food arrived, a plate of greasy eggs and bacon, though it barely looked appetizing. I pushed it around with my fork, the unease growing. I looked up at the waitress as she set down the plate and asked again, "Who is she?" The waitress froze, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the table's edge. "She's been here for years," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Same booth, same seat. No one knows where she came from or why she's here. But once she looks at you..." She swallowed hard, her eyes clouding over with fear. "It's over." I chuckled nervously. "Over? What does that mean?" The waitress didn't respond. She simply turned and hurried back into the kitchen, leaving me alone with my rising sense of dread. I couldn't tear my gaze away from the woman. Her stillness was unnatural, and now, it wasn't just unnerving, it was terrifying. I needed to see her face. I needed to know what the waitress was so afraid of. Maybe it was a morbid curiosity, or maybe something darker, but I had to know. Slowly, I stood up from my booth, my legs trembling beneath me. I approached her booth cautiously, my heart hammering in my chest. "Ma'am?" My voice came out shaky, barely a whisper. No response, not even a flicker of acknowledgement. I edged around the booth, trying to get a better look at her face. Her long hair covered most of it, but as I stepped closer, I noticed the faintest hint of rotting flesh peeking through. My breath caught in my throat, but I forced myself to take one more step. And then, she moved. Her head tilted ever so slightly, and I froze. The air seemed to grow heavier, the temperature dropping even further. I watched, paralyzed, as her hands slowly unclasped, fingers stiff and contorted as if they hadn't moved in years. Her head turned toward me, revealing her face. My stomach lurched. Her skin was rotten, sagging off her bones in dark, leathery patches. Her eyes were hollow voids, deep pits of nothingness that stared straight through me. But it was her smile that truly made my blood run cold. A wide, grotesque grin, stretched impossibly far across her face, the skin tearing at the corners of her mouth, exposing raw, jagged teeth beneath. I stumbled back, my body trembling uncontrollably. Her smile widened further, splitting her face, the sound of skin tearing filling the air. Blood oozed from the corners of her mouth, dripping down her chin in thick, dark rivulets. Her hollow eyes locked onto mine, and I felt something clawing at my mind, pulling me into the darkness of those bottomless pits. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My body refused to move, trapped under the weight of her gaze. I was drowning in her emptiness, the world around me collapsing as the diner seemed to fade away into the black void. Suddenly, her arms shot out with a sickening crack, bones twisting in unnatural angles as her fingers latched onto my wrist. Her grip was ice cold, and I could feel her fingers digging into my flesh, ripping through the skin like knives. Blood poured from the wounds, and the pain was excruciating, but I couldn't pull away. Her voice, raspy and broken, whispered through the silence. "You're mine now," I screamed, finally finding my voice, but it did nothing. Her fingers tightened, twisting and pulling at my flesh, tearing it away in chunks. I could hear the sickening squelch of my skin being peeled from muscle, the wet slap of blood hitting the floor. I collapsed, my legs giving out beneath me as she dragged me closer, her face hovering inches from mine. The smell of decay and rot filled my nostrils, and her grin widened even further, splitting her jaw open with a wet, bone-snapping sound. Her teeth, jagged yellowed shards, were inches from my throat. In one swift motion, she lunged, her teeth sinking into my neck with a sickening crunch. Agony ripped through me as I felt her tearing through muscle and sinew, her mouth filling with my blood. The world spun, darkness creeping in from the edges of my vision. As my blood pooled around me, her eyes locked onto mine, that horrible grin never faltering. The last thing I saw before everything went black was her face, that grotesque, rotting face, smiling down at me as she fed. And then, nothing.
The moment I walked into the diner, the greasy smell of fried food mixed with the faint scent of stale cigarette smoke hit me. It was just before midnight, and the place was deserted, except for the waitress, who stood behind the counter, idly flipping through a magazine. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a pale, sickly glow over the cracked linoleum floors and worn-out vinyl seats. It was a far cry from a cozy roadside stop, but I wasn't there for ambiance. I had heard the stories. The midnight special was a challenge, a dare passed around by the locals. Supposedly, if you stayed late enough and asked for it, the cook would whip up something that would test the limits of your stomach and sanity. Most people chalked it up to a gimmick to get some laughs out of drunk late-night patrons, but no one I knew had ever finished it. Some even claimed that those who tried ended up sick, or worse. I wasn't one to back down from a challenge though, and that night I was feeling especially adventurous. Maybe it was the long drive or the emptiness in my gut, but when I pulled into the parking lot, I made up my mind. I'd be the one to conquer the midnight special. I sat down at the counter and caught the waitress's eye. She was older, her face worn with years of working the graveyard shift, her eyes dull and tired. When I asked for the midnight special, she paused, her fingers tightening around the edges of her magazine. "You sure?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Her voice was low, almost cautious. "Most don't make it to the end." I gave a cocky grin, thinking it was all part of the shtick. "I'm sure." The waitress didn't respond, but something in her expression darkened as she turned and disappeared into the kitchen. The air in the diner felt heavier now, like the walls were pressing in on me. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed louder, more insistent, and with each passing second, the temperature seemed to drop. I tried to shake off the feeling, chalking it up to nerves. The diner was just old, run down, nothing to be worried about. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck prickled as I glanced around, feeling as though I wasn't quite alone. The only sound besides the clock was the distant clatter of pots and pans from the kitchen. No voices, no movement, just that cold, creeping silence. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the waitress returned, carrying a plate in her hands. She set it down in front of me without a word, her eyes never meeting mine. The burger was enormous, dripping with grease, the bun soggy and stained with the juices. Piled next to it were fries, limp and cold, like they had been sitting out for too long. But it was the smell that hit me the hardest, pungent, metallic, almost like copper, almost like blood. "Midnight special," she said flatly, her voice devoid of any emotion. She turned on her heel and walked back to the kitchen without waiting for a response, leaving me alone with the plate. I stared at the burger, my stomach churning already. There was something off about it, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The patty was dark, almost black, and it glistened under the flickering lights. I hesitated, but I had come this far. I wasn't about to chicken out now. I picked it up, the greasy bun squishing in my hands, and took a bite. The taste hit me immediately, and I had to fight back the urge to spit it out. The meat was tough, rubbery, with an overwhelming metallic tang. It didn't taste like beef, at least not any beef I'd ever had. The aftertaste was acrid, burning the back of my throat as I swallowed. I forced down another bite, grimacing. The whisper started then. At first it was faint, barely audible, like someone murmuring just behind my ear. I jerked my head around, but the diner was empty. The waitress hadn't returned. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, a hissing, rasping sound that seemed to crawl into my skull. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the burger, but with each bite, the whispers grew more intense. They weren't words exactly, more like guttural sounds, low and urgent, as if something was trying to communicate but couldn't form the language. My skin prickled and my stomach roiled with each chew. I glanced at the clock. It was just past midnight. That's when I heard it clearly, a voice, low and raspy, calling my name. Closer, come closer. I froze, the bite of food halfway to my mouth. The whisper wasn't just in my head anymore. It was real, tangible, right there beside me. Slowly, I turned toward the plate, my heart thudding in my chest. The burger moved. I dropped it immediately, watching in horror as the patty began to shift, undulating like something was trapped beneath the surface. The fries next to it twitched, tiny jerks as though they were struggling to come to life. My stomach twisted into knots as I stared, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. The whispers grew louder, more frantic now, filling my ears, pressing into my mind. Eat. More. I shot up from my seat, the chair screeching across the floor. My legs felt weak and I could barely stand as the whispers continued to wrap around me, suffocating, relentless. Suddenly, the kitchen door swung open with a bang and the waitress stepped out. But something was different. Her face was wrong. Her eyes were wide, too wide, bulging from her skull, and her mouth stretched into a grotesque, unnatural grin, her lips peeling back to reveal jagged, broken teeth. "Don't leave now," she rasped, her voice a broken croak. "You haven't finished." I stumbled backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The burger on the plate writhed now, splitting open down the middle as something slimy and dark slithered out from within. It was small at first, but as it crawled across the table, it grew, its form stretching, twisting into something monstrous. It was a mass of black, writhing flesh, dripping with a thick, oozing substance that smelled of rot and decay. Tendrils sprouted from its body, snaking across the table, reaching for me. I tried to move, but my legs were frozen in place, locked in terror. The waitress laughed, a wet, gurgling sound that sent chills down my spine. Her body began to contort, her bones cracking and shifting beneath her skin. Her neck twisted at an impossible angle, her eyes still fixed on me, that horrifying grin never faltering. The tendrils wrapped around my ankles, pulling me toward the table. I screamed, but no sound came out. My throat burned, my mind a whirlwind of panic as the black mass grew larger, its shape ever-changing, shifting between something human and something far worse. My skin burned where the tendrils touched, searing pain shooting up my legs as they dragged me closer to the plate. I struggled, kicking and thrashing, but it was no use. The whispers were louder now, deafening, a cacophony of voices all screaming for me to eat, to submit. The black mass reared up, looming over me, its surface bubbling and writhing as it split open to reveal a maw lined with rows of jagged teeth, dripping with a thick yellow bile. The smell was overpowering, like rotting meat and sulfur. My vision blurred, my head spinning as I fought against the nausea rising in my throat. It lunged. The pain was immediate, blinding. Its teeth sank into my shoulder, ripping through flesh and muscle with a sickening crunch. Blood poured from the wound, hot and thick, soaking through my clothes. I screamed, the sound raw and guttural, but there was no one to hear. The thing chewed, tearing chunks of flesh from my body as it fed, its tendrils wrapping tighter around my legs, pulling me closer, closer to its gaping maw. My vision dimmed, the world spinning as the blood drained from my body. I collapsed to the floor, my body limp and broken. The last thing I saw before the darkness took me was the waitress, her grin impossibly wide, her eyes gleaming with something dark and ancient, as she whispered, "Welcome to the midnight special."